In October 2017, the Weinstein story broke and engulfed the media. I think it's fair to say everyone was very shocked at the news. The scale of his abuses shocked the general public as well, not just the industry. It exposed a disturbing culture of silence in the film industry that had allowed Weinstein to routinely sexually assault, harass, and bully dozens of people over several decades. Anti-sexual assault movements like Me Too and Time's Up have quickly followed, and have resulted in a rightful toppling of many senior men within the industry, ranging from well-known actors to Amazon execs and news anchors. But how has our television and documentary industry reacted? 8 months after the Weinstein scandal first came to light, our distinguished panel will be discussing the scale of the problem within TV and documentary, and what is currently being done to combat the issue and what needs to change to create a safe working environment for all of us and the future talent. Before I introduce the panel, I've got two small notes to make. We are aware that this isn't a very diverse-looking panel, and I think it's fair to say finding people who are brave enough to come forward and talk about their experiences is very challenging. So this group, while it isn't fantastically diverse, apart from Tim, obviously. Hello, Tim.
You're welcome.
It's really just about courage. It's about people being able to come forward and talk about their stories. So please be aware that we have acknowledged that. And also, all of our guests here this morning, they're not going to be talking about particular cases or particular individuals, and they're not necessarily representing their organisations that they work for. This is their personal experience and opinions in these subjects. I think that's fair to say as well. So let me introduce my esteemed colleagues on the panel. First of all, we have Fiona Campbell, who is Controller of News, Mobile and Online at the BBC. We have Jane Merkin, freelance executive producer whose recent credits include the BAFTA and Emmy award-winning Exodus. We have Natasha Dack, co-founder of Tigerlily Films, and Natasha recently was the executive producer of the Channel 4 Dispatches working with Weinstein. We have Billie J.D. Porter, who's a journalist, filmmaker and presenter. And, as mentioned before, we have the lovely Tim Hunter, Director of Learning and New Talent at BAFTA. I'm your chair, Natasha Moore. I'm a campaigner at Directors UK, and I'm leading our initiative on anti-bullying and harassment. Okay, so our panellists come from very different parts of factual television, from news and current affairs through to popular factual. So I'd like to start the session by each of you telling us a little bit about your professional background and your personal experiences of bullying and harassment in our industry. So Fiona, if I can start with you.
Hi.
Down at the end. Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
So you've made it to the top of current affairs, very well-respected journalist and broadcaster, and you've become one of the very few senior-level women within the BBC. From your experience, do you feel that news and current affairs have a particular issue with bullying, with harassment and discrimination, or do you think times have changed quite significantly since you first started out?
Okay, so I've been in broadcasting for about nearly 25 years, and I think times thankfully have changed, compared to 20-odd years ago when I first began as a researcher in AP. I remember many's a day locking myself in toilets, basically trying to avoid people until they left the building because I didn't want to have a meeting with them where I was going to get talked to or treated in a certain way. And the way of surviving them was very much, let's just get through this, just getting through productions, getting through phases. And I think now, because obviously now I'm not on AP any longer, my division, there's 300 staff in the mobile and online division that I run. Many factors have led to things getting better. Yes, I am now one of the few senior women at the BBC. However, in news in the past 3 years, representation of women at senior management has gone up from about a quarter to nearly 44%. In 3 years, that's a pretty major achievement. And there's women editors of Panorama, of Newsnight, of Question Time, of The World at One. There's me. So a lot has changed very quickly. And I passionately believe that the more we can push diversity through leadership roles in companies, so different kinds of people from different backgrounds have a say in how workplaces are run, that will lead to better treatment for all. Because I think 20 years ago, you could argue 10 years ago, it was much less diverse leadership, so there were fewer people to talk to and you felt you were going to get the same answers and the same responses. So there wasn't as much incentive to speak out. I think now there's more people you can find to talk to. And, my advice to people is to build your network wide, and that's not necessarily an employment network, but it's an experience network. Anne Morrison is here, who was head of factual whenever I was starting out at the BBC. And people like Anne and people like me now hopefully are generous with their time, and dropping people like that an email to ask for experience or ask for help. People are there for you, and that is something that you should try and do, because you'd be surprised at the support that's there in the wider industry for you. I think you'd back that up, Anne. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So moving to Billie. Good morning, Billie. So you've obviously had a great deal of experience as a relatively young broadcaster and journalist and filmmaker. I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about the experience that you've had reporting bullying and harassment in terms of your own mental health, in terms of the support that you've been given. Do you have any views on what would be great and what would be helpful for you as someone who's experienced that?
Yeah, well, I think one of the reasons I was invited onto this panel is because I recently spoke out about the farce of an investigation that went on at Vice after various stories broke there about very, very inappropriate behaviour and crimes that were committed against women. I think that these HR procedures that are being put into place now ultimately are there to protect the company's interests, and I think that's really important for everyone to remember. I unfortunately regret being part of the investigation that I was part of at Vice, because I don't think that it's led to any kind of real change at the company at its core. And so I think that one thing that I really, really believe has been one positive that's come out of all of this is a real sense of kind of sisterhood between women from different production companies, from completely different areas in TV. And even just being invited onto this panel, the women that I've met here have been so kind of eager to help one another and elevate people in their own careers and in kind of protecting one another from individuals who maybe, are men to avoid. So I think that as well as there needing to be a really, really kind of strict HR response to all of this that serves to protect the women, not just the company's, legal interests, I think that women should be seeking to create their own network to protect one another completely separately to these corporations.
Thank you very much. So let's move on to Natasha. Good morning, Natasha. You recently made the Dispatches documentary Working with Weinstein, and it's specifically focused on individuals that had worked with him over many decades. What key things did you learn about that situation in terms of allowing it to proliferate? And are there any similarities in the British factual industry?
Yeah, I've worked in the industry for about 22 years, and interestingly, one of my first jobs in the industry was working as a runner on a feature film that Harvey Weinstein produced. So it's quite interesting all this time later to be having to deal with his lawyers after making the film. But I think it's really simple. He used his wealth and his power and his legal might to keep people quiet. I think he also used the threat of them never working in the industry again, which is really powerful for people at a sort of entry level.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, Jane. Hello. Hello. So you've worked in both commissioning and production. Could you tell us a little bit about your experiences in your career in this area?
So I started as a runner and worked my way up to an exec, which I am now. and have been for about over the past 10 years, and experienced and suffered from low-level sexual harassment and bullying throughout my career. And when I got to the point of being an exec, you kind of feel you're going to be immune from that now. And sadly, that wasn't the case. I was quite badly bullied at a company not that long ago. I thought that I would be able to deal with it in a more proactive way. But just like everybody else, you sort of think, okay, I've just got to get through this contract. I've just got to deliver this series, which I'm going to make the best I can, and I can't walk away from my team. And whilst you challenge the people who are doing the bullying, actually, I sadly don't think I made much of a difference in how they are going to treat people in the future. Maybe I did. I also, a few years ago, was working at a broadcaster and worked with two young secretaries who were both being badly sexually harassed by their bosses, and helped them take their cases to tribunals. What happened, and this is what's really sad about hearing what Billie has said, what happened is that the broadcaster brushed under the carpet, no action was taken against the senior men, and the women were moved to new jobs, which made me lose all confidence in those kinds of procedures and feel, well, we all just have to do it for ourselves. And I think, again, what Billie is saying about our informal networking, that I talk to a number of young women filmmakers who come to me informally, who I've just met in passing, and offer a place that they can talk about issues and maybe get a little bit of guidance. But I'm not trained in that. It's what instinctively, as a woman, I feel I need to do.
Okay, thank you very much. And Tim, finally, last but not least. So as Director of Learning and New Talent at BAFTA, you were obviously heavily involved in the drafting of the BAFTA and BFI bullying and harassment guidelines. Can you tell us about why these principles were drafted and what kinds of experience you've heard about through that process?
Sure. So obviously the Weinstein case was the kind of instigator of this, and there was a lot of people who were actually looking to BAFTA and other kind of organisations. I know Directors UK similarly and BFI for a solution. So we got our heads together. I had a phone conversation with Jen Smith, who was my sort of closest ally at the BFI on this, and we were just not only sort of surprised at the volume of stories that people were sharing, but also that there was really apparently no process for actually dealing with the behaviour, and it didn't seem that any of this poor behaviour had been tackled at any level. And so we just felt that there was probably a lack of awareness of some of the support that already existed out there. So we looked at that. We kind of saw that the ACAS had produced some fantastic guidance, but it was very geared towards organisations who've got big infrastructure and have got an HR team, and that the kind of the guidance that they'd published wasn't necessarily appropriate for a freelance industry or ones that groups of people that are coming together for kind of a few months or a few weeks or whatever. So we wanted to adapt that guidance and make sure that it was really suitable. We brought together as many of the industry organisations as we could, including Directors UK, including Directors Guild and PACT and everyone you can think of. And everyone sort of co-signed on this approach. So then we ran some focus groups. We had over 40 individuals who were at the coalface who we asked to come in, take part in focus groups and talk about their experiences and talk about how the guidance might be adapted to be more suitable for the kind of environments that you find within film, television and games. And the thing that was sadly not that surprising actually was that it was so, what people were talking about was so widespread and existed at every level, be it entry level, senior level, it was kind of every department, people had stories to share. And I think that the sexual harassment side of things has had a lot of attention, not criticising that at all. But the thing that there were more reports on was the bullying and the fact that kind of there's a real culture of people who are seen to be creative, who are then sort of given licence to behave however they want, and people don't tackle them. And so that was kind of what we really wanted to make sure we addressed within the guidance. And the other thing that I think we're going to talk a bit more about the guidance later, but I think it's really important to say that there's not one quick fix. We're not pretending that the guidance is going to solve everything. There needs to be a multifaceted approach. Everyone has a part to play, I believe, and the guidance is just the first step in ensuring that there are processes in place and that everyone understands what can be done, but also their rights and responsibilities under the law.
Great. Okay, thank you so much. Okay, so a recent Edinburgh TV Festival survey showed that 71% of those surveyed had experienced bullying at work, and 54% had experienced sexual harassment. I think, again, that's a fairly horrendous statistic. It seems the industry is recognising that bullying and harassment is still a genuine problem. Are there any particular problems that our panellists think are allowing this negative culture to continue? For example, is there a difference between the experiences of freelance workers and in-house staff? Anybody care to comment on that?
Yes. Yes, sure. Absolutely sure. I think a major issue about why this situation has been going on for decades is now we have such a loose way of working. You're so vulnerable all the time that people are terrified. If they make a complaint about somebody at an independent company, then they're going to be bad-mouthed throughout the business and they're never going to work again. And that is why, whether it's to do with bullying, sexual harassment, racism, discrimination of any kind, people just think, like I did, just shut up, get on with the job and get the job done and get out without destroying your career. So I think that that's fundamental to how we can change the culture, is around security of employment.
Great, thank you very much.
And we were talking earlier about how on call sheets you'll see, on a lot of call sheets nowadays, you'll see things about environmental concerns, so don't print this unless you need to, and so on. So why can't we put the things about behaviour, the behaviour that's expected from people who are working on productions, actually in writing in that way? So
I think actually in the BAFTA guidance, there's actually a suggestion that you have two designated officers essentially to deal with that.
On every call sheet, that's one of the key recommendations, that on every call sheet you have at least two people, can be more than two, of different genders, preferably not necessarily, not connected to the employer, so they're independent. And we're actually rolling out some training as well for those individuals. So at the moment we're just piloting that again with ACAS, and again, same issue, that their kind of guidance, their training is geared towards organisations with a kind of infrastructure that doesn't necessarily exist within the industry. So we're working on shaping that content so that it's more appropriate for the kinds of environments that you might find, the kind of workplace environments you might find in film, TV and games. The plan is that will be as freely available as we can possibly make it for the start of 2019.
Yeah, no, sorry. Yeah, I was going to say, having worked in television commissioning as well, I think adding that point to commissioning specs is really important, because then it becomes part of the contractual conversation that business entities have to have, and it just means, a bit like a safety assessment, if we could have a couple of named individuals on these forums that are trained, where there could be a joined-up mechanism behind that if somebody, no matter how junior they are, goes to one of those individuals, they then know how to either informally or formally, in whatever way that complainant would like, to progress the matter. Because it's not good enough to be a freelance junior person and then on top of everything else, having to figure out at every entity that employs you how the hell it works, who you can talk to, what's going to be the impact for you if you do raise something. So I think that's a really good recommendation to get completed.
Great, yeah.
Sorry, can I just say that I think there's two issues around that. One is that in this industry you can have independent companies, that are everything from 200, 300 people down to one person, a single person team. Yeah. And it's how do you ensure that the tiny little indies can do what it is that you're asking them to do within the commissioning spec. And I think the other issue is who is going to police this. It's fine to have it within the commissioning spec, but who is actually going to ensure that this is being fulfilled?
Yeah, that sense of independence, I think, is probably the biggest concern for everybody on this panel, probably everybody in this room. If you've got access to a procedure, is it independent? Is it truly going to support you, or is it going to protect a small elite team within the program-making environment? So, touching on that note, this sort of sense of independence and policing, do you think there are any solutions about how we can fix this idea of the elite being protected, the people who win awards, who, they've got an incredible career, they've got a great list of credits, and they've got several big pieces of brass and wood on their desk. Is there any way we can get around that?
Are there people with sort of known behaviour?
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, I guess, we don't employ them.
Yeah, I think the BFI are making it a condition of their funding, and we're talking to commissioners as well from the broadcasters to see if it's possible that they might also make it. Very good conversations at the moment, but it would be things like, as part of the conditions for a commission, you would have to have a policy in place, you would have to have procedures in place, you'd have to make sure that everyone in your team knows what the procedure is, and that you'd have to have that kind of provision for independent people. But at the end of the day, the people that will police it is the law. There are laws in place to protect you as an employee, and there are laws in place to set out what your responsibilities are as an employer. And I think that there's a real lack of awareness in the industry about that, actually, that if somebody raises a complaint and they have a legal case, and you as an employer have done nothing about it, you are also liable. You're also potentially liable for a legal case there. So at the end of the day, employers have to take this seriously. And I do think, I think part of it is making sure that the people with the money are also supporting it and saying, if you say you have a line in your budget to provide for somebody who is independent or whatever, that's considered a legitimate part of the budget. But at the end of the day, employers also need to be coming up with solutions and thinking laterally about this.
That's brilliant. Is there any way, do we think, that the industry could police those organisations, or is that too big a job to have a separate entity, maybe, that...
I mean, personally, I feel like the message needs to be that we need some sense of ownership from employers about this.
Right.
I mean, I'm not saying that that's a solution that's off the table, but I do think employers, it is an issue for employers, and that it's about the kind of environment that you're creating as an employer. And at the end of the day, you're the only organisation that can control that.
I would say that these issues of harassment, of sexual harassment and bullying, the issues that we were discussing yesterday on the diversity panel, the problem is that we've, as an industry, have been self-regulating, and it hasn't worked. It hasn't worked. These issues have been around for 20, 30 years. Well, longer, obviously, but we've been talking about them for 20, 30 years. And yes, there have been small changes, and the fact we are openly talking about this issue now is obviously a positive, but self-regulation, I don't think, has worked.
Okay, I think that's a good view.
I was in Cannes Film Festival recently, and they announced this hotline that you could phone if you've been, sexually harassed. And everyone was just laughing about it because it was obviously, too little, too late. So no one phoned the hotline. Oh. So I don't know if that's got anything to do with it, but it's just interesting that they tried to put something in place. Obviously way, way, way after the event.
I think another thing that's worth, it's depressing to say, but I think another thing that's worth considering is when you do talk about the law or a company legally having to respond to certain complaints, you also have to consider what, say, a young woman's personal justice will be from that situation. So if you're talking about men who are multi-billionaires, even if they're completely disgraced for the rest of their life, they can essentially cash out and go on and live their lives. If you're a young woman and you're basically being told that you should go through a very long, traumatic criminal investigation, that you should raise this complaint to this union or do X, Y, Z, will you, at the end of that 6 months, will you have really won, even if you've won a case? Or can you even financially support yourself? Is that going to derail your career? I think that that's something to consider. There are some men who, even if they've committed, and I think it's important to note as well, it's not just sexual harassment. We're talking about instances of rape here. there are some men who will and have gotten away with this, and the women might not be in a position to fulfill every complaint or see it through till the end. They just simply can't. Some of them.
I completely agree. I think that's a really good point, and I don't mean to sound at all dismissive of that and the impact of that on the individual. But I would say this is about a cultural change as well, and a kind of the whole culture around the acceptance of these kinds of behaviours and the fact that they go unchallenged. That needs to change. But I don't in any way kind of underestimate the effect of that on the individuals.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that Weinstein only got sacked by his company when everyone knew about it. He didn't get sacked when they knew about it.
Well, he had a smile on his face as he was handcuffed as well. So, I mean, it's
Problematic.
But in terms of... Sorry.
But that's why I think, it is tied up with the needs to change the workforce in the industry. I was given a report I had to read that's embargoed, and and I looked at the opening page, and every it was a white male of a certain age was the profiled individual in the opening report, and I'm just like, really? I mean, some organisations putting this out and they haven't even thought about this part of the story. So until, and a lot of organisations kind of understand that they need to change, but they're not changing fast enough. I think, in all broadcasting, all digital platforms, all independent companies need to realise that their leadership needs to look different, have different stories, and that's going to make their output better and find a different talent base for them. And that's part of it as well, because if everybody looks the same and has been through the same 20 years experience, then nothing's going to change. These things go in tandem, and a different kind of workplace where you can say in a meeting, actually, I don't agree with what you said, actually, I find what you say offensive, where that is a normal part of the conversation. Is also everybody here in this room, frankly, will be in workplaces where they can say things and do things that changes the environment of where they work. So it kind of falls a bit on everybody rather than waiting for some sort of set of guidelines or regulatory framework to come down on us. A lot of people do share with me their personal situations, and you just have to try as best you can every day to help and move somebody's situation on, and everybody in this room can do that, I think.
Yeah, and just a very quick, simple thing that I think would make start to make a difference is as an employee, if you ask your employer, where is your policy, what is your procedure for dealing with this, and start to ask before you take a job, because I think that's a way of, I don't particularly like the word policing, but kind of accountability. It's kind of ensuring that kind of we're all responsible for that accountability. When employers realise that it's important to you as an employee and it makes them a more attractive employer, then I think that will make a small difference, but it's all part of the same solution.
I completely agree, but potentially for someone who's young, who's maybe getting their first directing job or some, in that situation, to go in and before you've even started work, to raise a question that the employer might find a challenge is asking a lot of people and asking them to be very confident about who they are and being able to say those things. Absolutely, people should, but it is all a confidence thing, and that's the problem with us as freelancers. We're all vulnerable. Yeah,
I do think there's a generational shift. There was a kind of a study that I saw that I can't remember the percentage, but it was a majority of under 24-year-olds will look for an employer's diversity policy before they take a job. So I think there's the younger generation are perhaps a bit more willing to ask those questions.
So one of the things, like for example, I'm not saying this is perfect, but one of the things that we've been doing at BBC Stories, which is our digital current affairs team, that's actually Anna and Jeremy who are here. If you want to talk to them afterwards about it, I'm going to tell you about a new recruitment thing we're doing, is that we're not putting emphasis on the interview at all. It's all about the piece of work, the idea that you deliver in advance of the interview, and then the interview actually it's hardly weighted at all, and it's much more of a conversation, and it's not those structured, horrendous questions that those formal interviews go through. So trying to experiment with those different, and that really applies as well to the independent sector, where exactly you're walking in to meet somebody who's potentially some big cheese executive producer, and actually you've never met them before, and this is all a bloody nightmare. Everybody can experiment with, changing the way they recruit people as well, and that sets a certain tone that you're then joining into team-wise. So if you're interested in those different types of recruitment, Anna and Jeremy are there. Do you want to put your hands up? Because I think it's just worth, anybody who has that power about how places recruit, you need to really start changing that as well.
I think it's probably important to say at this point that I think everyone again would agree that slightly more formal hiring practices within the industry would help. If part of the issue is that you might lose your job and be branded as a troublemaker when you complain or make raise an issue, you're very reliant on your next job. You need to be able to pay the mortgage. So if there were slightly more formal recruitment practices that didn't rely on these kind of verbal references, do we think that would be something that the industry would embrace, or do we think that they would probably say that's a step too far?
I mean, people just talk, don't they? I know that I've got a reputation of being really hard to work with. I don't think that's about to change, even if I'm not hard to work with. But of course, there are some things that do protect you as an employee. Prior to all of this, I had a really bad experience with Vice, where I'd been hired to work for years, on and off, mostly full-time towards the end. And then I was let go, and I wasn't protected at all. So no severance pay. I had to get a lawyer involved. I was then rehired a year or so later. But, as a freelancer, you are so vulnerable. And like you say, I mean, I'm never going to own a house, so paying the mortgage isn't a concern of mine. But I do need to survive. You are reluctant to kind of to raise these issues, and like I said before, it got to a stage with me where I was like, okay, I'm only going to take this so far. I'll take the crumbs of severance pay that they're offering me, even though I know that I probably could get more if I rode this out, because I'm literally not going to be able to pay my rent if I see this through. So yeah, 100%. I think there need to be stricter rules around freelancers being protected, but I ultimately don't think that that's going to stop, old white guys at the pub moaning about, girls that they think are troublemakers or have a big mouth. They're always going to do that.
I think that hard to work with tag is a really gendered thing. I always hear it about women directors, whoever, and it always makes me question where that's coming from, because I seriously have never heard a male director described to me as hard to work with. It's always so strong and opinionated or whatever. And so in a way that makes me kind of more attracted to working with a woman director if I hear that she's hard to work with, because I want to kind of unpick what that means.
So to some degree, there's a degree of gender discrimination at play here. Sort of your privilege to be here as women in the industry anyway. Do we think that that's a part of the status quo?
Yeah. Well, there are less women employed. So I mean, in some ways, obviously that's depressing. But in some ways, you are like, I do have to cling on to this, because there are a million other people in line for this job. You do feel like you are quote unquote lucky to have this thing.
Yeah. Okay.
I think that probably affects the willingness to sort of stick together as well. That if you feel so individualised, the fact that you might know that somebody is terrible to work for, you might be less inclined to say, I've heard this story that you're terrible to work for, and so I'm not going to work for you. That kind of. Whereas I think where perhaps departments, and I've heard this anecdotally, but the sort of departments where there's like electricians, for example, I've heard that they do stick together a lot more, and if you treat one of them badly, then none of them will work for you. So I just feel like that kind of that sense that you're lucky to be there and that you're on your own and you're a kind of real outlier because you're a woman in a man's world. Like I think you're probably less inclined to stick together.
So we're going back to that idea of this informal network being a source of support, a source of solidarity and advice from your peers. Let's flip that on its head as well. I think it's important to raise this. If we as people in the industry are talking with our friends about people who are tricky to work with, do we think that that's open to abuse with us, for example? We'd hope not, but this sort of the whisper network, is that a positive thing overall, do we think, or is it potentially damaging if you're on the receiving end of it, maybe?
Well, I think in terms of bullying and harassment, then I think that, it's obviously there for a reason, isn't it? The whisper network's there because it needs to be. And because nothing's being done about those people that are in those positions of power who are bullies and harassers. So,
So you think it's valuable. Okay, great.
Yeah, it's definitely risky. You've got to be very careful about, what you're saying about people. But at the same time, if there's no process in place, if there's no formal process for dealing with that kind of behaviour when it comes up, then, people are going to rely on kind of other alternatives. So it's all the more reason why employers should have a process in place.
One thing we haven't really touched on too much is mental health. And I think, again, that's something that the panel, I'm sure, can comment on. It's not just about bullying and harassment, it's your general well-being as well. So do any of you have any particular views around what would be helpful in terms of mental health support?
Well, this is just something I wanted to talk about as well, because I think that the two are connected. I've had, I can't remember how long ago it was now, but I've had, driven to burnout and complete. Some of you will know probably this hilarious story of my burnout scenario at the RTS Awards. But I have been through this, and the baby, but what we have now is we have a mental health awareness program at the BBC, and the people who've been through the training to be a mental health first aider wear a different coloured ribbon around their neck. And that is just good in that you can see visibly in the company who has that kind of professional training, and they are there for you to talk to in any. It could be your mental well-being, the fact that you're being bullied, the fact that you're feeling under pressure. So you can literally pick the kind of person you might want to go and talk to, who might just be drifting around the building. And I think that visibility, together with, we have at BBC Stories, which again Jeremy and Anna run, have mental health lunches, and we're basically surfacing that conversation where you can talk about your anxiety, your stress, your burnout, and I just think that can only be a good thing to make normalising those conversations. And also that does send a very heavy signal to people who are more oppressive bulliers in the company that actually you cannot get away with behaving like that anymore, because the conversation has changed, and having these different kinds of conversations are more important now. So again, I think small companies, how are they going to be able to access those mental health training programs or awareness schemes? That is a problem. It's easier, obviously, for the BBC. But I think it's good to live in a space of what we can do, and dealing with mental health in parallel with this is really important, because you need to look after your mental health in order to get through some of these situations, frankly.
I agree with what you said before about it being very difficult for smaller production companies to implement that sort of thing. And as much as, it's becoming less stigmatized to speak openly about mental health, I still think that in this industry, people want so much from you if you're a freelancer. These schedules are so grueling, and at the beginning, I don't know if other people have to sign these, but at the beginning of a production with an independent production company, I always have to sign a statement of health form for insurance reasons. If there's anything that might lead you to have to take time off work, and there's a section where it's like, have you ever suffered depression? Have you ever been treated for depression? Do you believe that there is, stress that could cause you from not being able to fulfill this production? The answer to all of those questions for me is yes, but I don't think I've ever written that on a form, because and also I don't know that there would necessarily be the room for that to kind of be taken into account if you're shooting for 18 hours a day or more sometimes, and everyone's really stressed. There sometimes isn't that isn't taken into account. I don't know that there's ever been a conversation between me and my crew who's, where people are like, okay, if everyone's super sleep deprived and everyone feels like shit, we're gonna, you know, take some time out. It's never like that. You just all have to like get what you can, and then, you know what I mean? It's such a stressful job that I don't think that people even have the room to consider the impact on people's minds.
Do we think this is leading to a sort of creative talent drain then, where people are just saying, it's too much, I just can't carry on with it?
Burnout is definitely a big issue, and nobody really wants to talk about it, but, you know, it never goes away. I don't know what you think, Jane.
I think what's happened recently is, over the past few years, that because independent companies are using psychologists to profile or do assessments on potential contributors much more, they are more open to members of staff talking to psychologists or therapists or whatever it is. And that is absolutely to be encouraged. And I try and encourage it not just because the amount of hours that people are doing and the pressure that you're under, but also quite often because of the projects that I work on, you're dealing with some very difficult and traumatic issues and individuals, and you need help and support in that. And what that can mean is that you could go and access psychologists on a direct work issue, i.e. working with a vulnerable individual. But within that session, you can then discuss any issues of bullying or sexual harassment. So as far as your employer is concerned and those around you, you're going to talk about a work issue, a project-based issue. So it will hopefully make people feel less stigmatized about doing that. And that's something that I try and get in place. But as Fiona says, for a small indie, it's really hard because it's an expensive process.
There was the helpline that's being run by the film and television charity, formerly called CTBF. It's 24 hours, free to use, and they can support people with any kind of mental health issues as well. They have not only people who are trained to deal with you on the line, but they also have mechanisms in place. If you do need a bit of extra support, they can help to direct you in the right place, and in some circumstances can help to fund it for you as well.
But interestingly, when you put that sort of support into a budget as a line item, often you'll get a knockback from the broadcaster, from the programme finance manager. He'll say, you know, what's this in there for? How's this contributing to production?
I also think that it's quite. I feel quite conflicted about relating these two problems, even though they are obviously linked, because I know women from various companies who have had issues and have raised instances of sexual harassment, who do also suffer from mental health problems, and some of them feel that it almost delegitimizes their case, you know. So there is this thing of, like, obviously if you're being harassed in the workplace, you might suffer from anxiety and depression, whereas if you state this on a piece of paper and show a note from your doctor saying that you've got a borderline personality disorder, people will be like, oh, okay, well, did that really happen? Or were you having an episode? Did you really see that for what it was? And I know lots of women who are very, very, very eager to make sure that there's a distinct line between the two, so that people don't think that they're, like, overreacting.
It's a bit of a vicious circle then, isn't it, really? We've had a number of different movements spring up over the recent months, namely Me Too, Time's Up, 50-50. What impact do you think those movements are having on reshaping this environment?
Sorry, I'm going to be very cynical, but really what it's done is that our industry is great about covering these topics, but not actually using them to look in on themselves. So, you know, the number of films that have been made or programs that have been made about Me Too, about sexual harassment, about bullying is fantastic, but for some reason we don't reflect that back on ourselves.
This room should be full of, you know. I actually think it's appalling that it's not, that a kind of international summit of broadcasters and filmmakers and various production companies, that there aren't people, like, queuing up to be outside here to discuss this, because it's, you know, it's kind of insane that it's not.
Absolutely.
I would say that sorry, I feel like the Pollyanna on the panel, but I think that none of this conversation would have happened without the Me Too movement, and I feel like it's at least a space where women are believed. I think kind of a lot of the reports are that kind of women don't come forward and don't share their experiences because they feel that they're not going to be believed. I feel like that's really changing. And I also feel like as a gay man kind of growing up, I was kind of told, you can't change the people in power. You've got to just you've got to change the amount of power that you give them, and you've got to make it not affect you. And I feel like that's a shift as well. That actually, it's also the responsibility of people in power now that they're responsible for all of us, and they're responsible for the environment that they're creating. They don't just have license to behave however they want to. And so for me, I'm a little bit more encouraged.
Yeah, no, I think just from my own personal experience, so I've only been in a senior management role for like 4 years, and I think I feel much more empowered, to use that word, to speak out and say things at sort of high level meetings, and I am listened to. The degree to different people react and do things differently off the back of what I say, but it can't just be. Whereas 20, 15, 10 odd years ago, it would be much harder to say that kind of thing at those kind of meetings. I think things have changed. It doesn't mean it's any easier, but things are changing.
Yeah, I want to get in touch with Laura Bates from Everyday Sexism, because a couple of years ago she said that 3/4 of the women who reported sexual harassment felt that there was no change at all, and 16% of those women felt that the outcome was made it even worse for them. So I'd quite like to get in touch with her, maybe in a year's time, and just see if she did that survey again, if anything had changed. And obviously, if it hasn't, then we're doomed, aren't we? But
So, Tim, could you talk to us a little bit about the guidance and the code of conduct and what that includes? And essentially, do you know where it's being used, and is it being used in television at the moment?
We've had some sort of anecdotal reports that people are using it, and that people have started off productions by reading out the principles. So there's two sides to the what we publish. There's the principles, and then there's guidance. The principles are general kind of a statement of intent for employers and employees to sign up to, and you can put it on your website, you can put it on your LinkedIn, you can put it in your CV if you want to, but it really just says that you want to be part of the sort of solution, that you understand your rights and responsibilities under the law. Then the guidance is a bit more practical information, and so there are things like, and I just want to restate, we're not saying this is a panacea for all problems. There are obviously things that would fall outside of this sort of mechanism for dealing with it, but the guidance then has many recommendations, and there's a section, like I was saying earlier, for employers and for employees. And we thought that was really important because we want both sides to know what the other side knows, so that the employees can hold the employers to account, and the employers also know what they should be putting in place for the employees. So we thought that was really important that the guidance comprised both of those aspects. But what we recommend is that you start a production and you say you have a compulsory meeting where you outline the kind of behaviour that you're expecting, and you say, this is the kind of environment that I want to create is one where bullying and harassment doesn't exist, and you can say that it's all about everybody being able to contribute at their best, and that's why it's really important to you as an employer. So hopefully that will do something towards the fact that a lot of people said that they didn't come forward because they didn't think that they were going to get supported. We think it's very important to be very public about your commitment to combating this behaviour. So start the production with that meeting, have your principles guidance, have your policy freely available, make sure that everyone's read it, make sure that everyone signs a declaration that they've read it, have the two people on the call sheets or wherever they need to be that are kind of trained to deal with it. You can also from the worker side of point of view, we recommend you take notes, that you understand what a formal process and an informal process looks like and what the difference is between those, and that's in the guidance. Don't be a bystander. I think that's really important as well. Under the law, if you witness behaviour, you can also raise that complaint on behalf of the victim. You don't have to be the victim yourself. And also just on the point of the law, the guidance goes beyond the legal requirement. So what we're saying is there are people, harassment under the law in an employment context has to be connected to one of the protected characteristics. So those which are outlined in the Equalities Act. So it has to be about gender or about sexuality or race, etc., etc. So there are behaviours that would fall out of the legal kind of definition of harassment. But what we're saying is you can use the law as a model and you can extend it to everyone that you engage with. So that gets around the kind of any grey areas around freelancers, any grey areas around service providers, because as an employer, you can choose to say, I'm offering this protection and this process for everyone that I bring onto the set. So don't you be a bystander and use the support line. And the support line not only offers advice, but it's also really good for data as well. So that's a really important aspect. If you're just reporting it, we have a much better sense of the scale of the problem and where it is and whether it's localised in particular departments or whether it's localised in particular regions. So that, I think it's really important to encourage people to use that helpline when they've experienced this kind of behaviour. And of course, if there's anything criminal, report it to the authorities.
Great. So Fiona and Jane, do you think that it would be possible to bring these kinds of guidelines into commissioning contracts? And do you think it would have any particular challenges?
Do you want to start, Jane, already? And I come in, yeah.
Well, yes. Anything is possible. But again, it just goes back to who's going to police it and how it's going to be policed. I think that's the only issue for me. Whether the indie really adheres to it, to every letter of it, who is going to spend the time monitoring that?
Okay.
I think it's kind of not since 2018, coming 2019, that this kind of thing isn't on a commissioning contract, because at the end of the day, it's just about respect at work and the values of the industry that we all work in, which is about giving everybody a voice. It's kind of nuts it isn't. And in terms of somewhere to start, it seems like a really good place because it can spread across an industry and a conversation and give somebody, be it a runner, an assistant producer, somebody else that's visible that they can actually reach out to and talk to who maybe isn't connected to that company. So, I really hope that that PACT and the broadcasters will go with this. I don't know.
Yeah, they were part of the working group, and we're going to come back together and kind of talk about ways that we can ensure that our members are using and aware of the guidance. There's another point about the police, and I'm going really hard on this procedure. Yeah. But another really important aspect of the process, going back to what you were saying about recruitment, is that if you have gone through a process, then when you're getting a reference for someone, you can say, has there been any complaints about this person? As the former employer, you are legally entitled to say, yes, there was this process, there was a complaint raised, we investigated it, and we found actually there wasn't anything to worry about, or we took this action. That's perfectly legitimate to say. So that's, again, another reason why kind of a procedure and a process is really, really important.
Okay, great.
That's a really good point.
So this idea of independence and regulation has come up a few times during this discussion. Having a separate body as a regulator, something not Ofcom, but something like Ofcom, that's separate to production companies and broadcasters to oversee complaints, obviously that would be ideal. Do you guys think that would be something that the industry could come together on to create? Or, again, are we just too disparate at the moment for that?
I think there's a kind of issue about introducing yet another sort of regulatory body. I know I said we haven't been self-regulating well enough, but to introduce another body, I think that the practices and processes should already be in place, and with these more developed guidelines, absolutely will be there. The issue, I think, is about getting the individuals who are suffering from sexual harassment or bullying to have somewhere to come forward to talk to people who can then take that on and help them through the process. So the kind of regulation of it, I think, is less of the issue. The issue is getting people to come forward and then to be guided through that process.
Yeah. So I have a lot of people who come and talk to me, but then when you try and say to them, well, you could do this and you could do this and you could do this, none of them are terribly appealing, going back to Billie's point, because you can see them thinking, shit, do I really want to take it to that level? Do I really want to put myself through that? Do I really want to... And I feel that there's a gap in the way a system could work before you have to take it into some horrific, personally draining process.
I think that has been a problem with the sort of demise of the trade union, because that would have instinctively been the place that I would have gone to for that kind of help and support, and for somebody to guide you through it and to protect you, which I think is what you really need. But that's not to say that there aren't organisations like Directors UK, BAFTA. But the problem is knowing, for those young people to know, or those people to know, that's where you can go to get that help and support and protection.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say when the working group came together to develop guidance, there was quite a representative group around that table. So I think any of those bodies would be willing to step up and step in and help if there was a complaint. Do you think that's reasonable, Tim?
Yeah, I think there are issues. I think in terms of offering advice and guidance and information, and just to your point, the training that we're rolling out does cover kind of exactly how to manage that process, what a formal process looks like, and what an informal process looks like, and what we're calling constructive conversations, where you can tackle behaviour without disrupting the production, because I know that's everyone's primary concern. So the training does cover some of that. I think for us, BAFTA, for the BFI, I'm sure for you as well, that kind of there's issues about setting ourselves up as a regulatory body. We couldn't, because we're a charity, and so there are kind of complexities around that. So it's not to say it's impossible, and I'd love it if it was possible. Like, I think that it would be a really good move, but I think in the meantime, I do think we need to send the message that employers need to start taking this seriously.
Okay. On that note, I'm going to open questions up to our panel. Please be aware that, again, not going to answer questions related to specific individuals or events, but anything other than that, please do feel free. Yes, this lady in the blue top. We have some roaming mics here, so...
Hi guys, I work for an agency which represents freelance editors, and I just was wondering about getting your feedback, I guess, on working with agencies that represent these freelancers and seeing if they can do anything on their side as well, so they've got a safety net.
Great question.
It's another element that we haven't really explored yet, but yeah, no, we'd love to. Yeah, I think it's a really good idea. I think it really is about awareness, and the more we just have to try every approach we can, really, just really get the word out there.
Yeah.
We were talking about this earlier, that we can have some fantastic, the most fantastic guidelines in the world, but unless people know about them, then they're kind of pointless. So I absolutely agree that they should be disseminated through agencies. I think also through place like Talent Manager, which is the first port of call. There's so many people now through all those kind of online recruitment services that can have the guidelines and also provide information of places where people can go for help and support. And I think that would be, because that would address the most vulnerable of our, the people working in the industry.
Yeah, and I do just another quick thing. I think that's why it was really important that we have 30-plus organisations all sign up to this guidance, and anyone is also welcome to come on board, any other organisation, because if we're all singing from the same hymn sheet, then we'll just make a lot more progress than if everybody's doing their own thing, I think.
Yeah, so I think that's fair to say. Yeah. Working for a member body myself, I'm very aware that our members are freelancers and they need support from their professional association, and we're doing a lot of work around that at the moment. So I think it's really important to speak to your colleagues in your professional networks and also in your guilds and unions and professional associations, because they have got a ton of information and they're trying to get it out to you. So do reach into them and try and get that data from them. So I think that's really important too. Okay, next question. In the front row, Toril, hi.
Hello. A couple of things. I've agreed with quite a lot of what's said, and I think basically there needs to be a sea change of cultural change in the way that we approach this, that we do empower people to come forward. But on a practical level, I think there are a couple of things that I think can be done. One of them is this informal references. I believe that people can be so scared of putting their heads above the parapet because they're scared that when they get a reference, it's informal, it's verbal. So I would like to see end interviews and a possible written reference that you come out with. So if anything's said, it's said there and you have a chance to defend it, because very often you don't know that it's being said, and sometimes these references are taken up before you even get an interview because somebody knows the exec or the producer or whatever. So you may not even get an interview. That's the first thing. So I think you need to have a process where you can possibly have an end interview, certainly come away with a written reference. So if anything negative is said about you, you've got a chance to counteract that. That's the first thing. The other thing that I would like to see within our industry is that, and it's a big wish, but that the budgets are increased so there isn't this stress-related work practice, so that people aren't so stressed that they are bullying. They're not always bad people. They are just stressed. And if we had a climate of more humane working conditions, that might alleviate some of the problem. Not a question, I'm sorry, it's just a comment.
Well said.
Thank you. Next. Oh, this young lady over here.
Thank you very much. It's really fantastic to hear all of you talk and hear everything that's been put in place. I completely agree. The difference that shifted with the Time's Up is the fact that people are being heard, and the idea that emotional and psychological abuse or emotional and psychological injury is actually being recognised, and that's what the difference is. I just want to share with you the work that I've been doing. I'm a movement director, and I've been developing clear guidelines in the industry for sex scenes. It's called the Intimacy on Set Guidelines. And my intention is that, along with the codes of conduct and the anti-harassment and anti-bullying, is that these guidelines become inherent as part of the industry. That when a producer looks at a script, they look at a fight, they'll put money aside for a stunt coordinator. They look at a dance, they'll put money aside for a choreographer. If they see there's a sex scene, they should either put in place the intimacy on set guidelines or to employ an intimacy coordinator. I have the joy of working on 2 different TV series at the moment, first ever as an intimacy coordinator, and I'd love to speak to all of you just to share further. And please, everybody, intimacy on set guidelines, and my hope and desire is that in 5 years' time nobody would dream of doing a sex scene and just saying to people, just do it, just improvise it, where people get groped and touched and dealt with in ways that are really not appropriate.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have the gentleman right at the back of the room. Hello. Thank you, sir. The mic's on its way to you.
Hello. I run a small independent production company, and my staff now and previously have been mainly young women. Every single one of them has got unbelievable horror stories that they've experienced, and I think that there's one thing that no one's really touched upon, which is that although there's lots of grey areas and conflicting stories, there are some big repeat offenders in this industry who have very close relationships with those at the top of the industry, and there's a collusion there. And what I think we can learn from Harvey Weinstein is that one big victim, from his point of view, one big sort of name that gets taken down puts all those other men on notice. And I think there's lots of subtleties, but there's also some really obvious action to take as well.
Yeah, I think you're completely right. And, anecdotally, we heard lots of stories on a very similar take to yours. And I think, broadcasters really need to take a proper look at themselves because, for example, one story we heard was about a woman who'd been harassed by someone who is a national treasure. And she referred it to the producers, and they didn't do anything about it. And she referred it up, and it went to the top of the broadcasting organisation. And they said, basically, we're choosing between you and him. And they chose him. And that's not an isolated case at all. So.
And I think it's important in that context to remind ourselves that, of course, it's not just women who suffer from sexual harassment. There are senior women who have behaved inappropriately with men and with other women as well. But men are as vulnerable to it, especially when they're starting out in the industry.
I think that's a really important point. Yeah, I totally agree. Okay. The lady in the red top, please.
I just wanted to, someone spoke about, you need to be careful about what you say, and I just wanted to make a point really about hierarchy. The thing about hierarchy is it's a triangle, it's more populated at the bottom. And I would encourage people to talk to each other actually about things that have happened to you. I would not encourage you to just repeat hearsay. I'm very lucky that I'm staff where I am, and I think people who are staff and have security of tenure really have an obligation to ensure. So, because I work in development, I've got a network of. I'm sitting next to somebody now. We're a very close community, and there are independents that are guilty of really terrible behaviour, and we all talk to each other about it. And I've got friends who we just won't work at certain companies, and I can see that there is a danger of that. But I also think there's a lot of power in that. And actually, I would just say to anyone here, if you're staff and something happens to you, things have happened to me, you really have an obligation, I believe, and that is what I learned from the whole Harvey Weinstein thing, is that there is a lot of power in numbers. And the good thing about being at the bottom, I suppose, is, we can protect each other, and I think we should.
Okay, thank you. Next, lady in the second row with the striped top.
Hi. I guess to follow on from the lady's comment over there about so I'm a young person that works in both TV and film, and I'd say that the big thing that seems to be order of the day in both production companies and production will always be either what you were saying, schedules and budgets, and essentially the idea that we all have to band together to just get the job done. Or if, as I've now progressed to be like producing and directing programs, it'll be like, well, the commissioner said, or it'll be like the commissioner needs this, and so you just need to work a weekend, or the commissioner said this, or you were saying that people are stressed, and so they might be acting towards you in a certain way, just because we're all here just trying to get the job done. So for me, I think it's a brilliant and amazing a lot of the stuff that people are talking about in terms of for people to seek support, and that does have to be there. But I think at the end of the day, what Billie brought up when she first spoke, which is from the point of an employee at least, it really seems to me that a lot of the time that people will instigate these things now because they have to, not because they want to. And kind of also, Natasha, when you were saying even when you put it in a budget, it's kind of just seen as this other thing to be dealt with. Yeah. And so for me, I do think that the thing that I'd really love, like when I came to this, that I really wanted to see was ultimately the idea that, for me at least, as someone kind of coming up, it really, I'm like looking up for the solutions, because I do think that it is great, and it not only just in terms of informal networks, in terms of in the industry, it's like a lot of us are lucky enough to have like friends and family, and you will have options to talk about stuff that you're going through. But most of all, it's kind of like, great, I can do that, but there are just certain things flat out I cannot change. And I think for me, it's just like, that's what I really want to see, the things that I can do everything possible. I can reach out to every single woman on my production and just be as supportive as possible, and I can speak out as much as I want. But at the end of the day, I do think that the thing is, when it comes to work, is that I always am made to feel that, again, it's this idea that it's like, well, we're all doing things because we have to, because of these guidelines that have been set by the stress of the work and the burdens of the work. And so like, with that, I would love to hear the panel actually then specifically talk about whether, in terms of with stuff that has happened, whether they day-to-day have changed the way that they do see the work and the necessity of the work. Because though I like love my job and I live for my job, at the end of the day I do tell people it's like, you're making TV and film, and it's, we're not firemen, or
Anybody like to comment?
Well, I mean, I don't know. You know how cynical I am about all of this anyway. So I think that, to me, I'm sure that the idea of implementing guidelines like this, as brilliant as they are, will summon, like sighs and eye rolls from male executives across the country, because it seems like a chore to them. And I think that, there have been so many instances of men who, when these complaints do arise, they're allowed to discreetly leave a company, offered with a huge payout, or they're offered voluntary redundancy, and they kind of still have a sparkling CV to their name, whereas the women who have been brave enough to come forward are deeply traumatized. And I think that there hasn't been enough of a kind of like, and this sounds really, really dramatic, but I think that there should be more men who are full on like disgraced by this, I don't think that enough careers are ending over people's past behaviour. I think that more women's careers are actually ending because of the time that they're having to dedicate to this. And I think that until that happens in a very, very public sense, until people are completely like, don't touch that company with a barge pole, never go near that man, it is just going to seem like an annoying thing that a production company has to do, isn't it? It's not dangerous enough. It doesn't. The risk isn't high enough, I don't think. Still.
I mean, I don't want to disagree with any of that, but the response that we've had so far has actually been gratitude. Like, I think people are really unaware of how to deal with these issues, and that's why they've done it. In the majority of cases, some people obviously are willfully oblivious, but I think a lot of people just don't have the tools at their disposal, and have been quite grateful for the guidance, providing some of those tools. And when we're doing the training, still very early days, but you just sort of see kind of people's the sort of weight lifting off their shoulders almost. That there's kind of like some tools to deal with these issues that aren't going to disrupt the production. I think one of the things that people just have to, another part of the cultural change is that no one is bigger than the team, and I think that's a big message that people need to embrace. That just because somebody is a BAFTA winner or is a person that's kind of the commission is notionally based on, that doesn't mean that everyone else in that team is any less than them. And you, as the person who's bringing the team together, you want everyone to be able to perform to the best of their abilities, and this is all part of that.
Okay.
I'd just like to say very quickly that I think the only way that this culture is going to be changed is for us all from top to bottom, from bottom to top, to come together and to take responsibility and to work to change it. I think there is a bigger issue. We're not working as an industry in isolation from the rest of the world, and the culture that exists in the television industry is sadly a reflection of the wider culture within the country. And for us to change that, I think part of that is going to come about by what it is that we do, which is making television documentaries, making programmes, and getting the discussion out there and forcing people to have this discussion on every level.
Great, thank you. I was going to say, have you got a final word?
Well, I was just going to say, one thing we haven't really got into is in terms of bullying behaviour, is that relationship between independent companies and commissioning editors, because I think that's something that, that there does exist a culture of bullying within that relationship. And it's like, that whole thing about you wanting your next job and so on, and I think that's mirrored in that commissioning editor production company relationship at some times.
Okay, I think we're getting our signal here that we need to wind things up. So please join me in thanking our panel for their excellent contributions today. That's been incredibly helpful, and I'm sure if you want to speak to any of them, they'll be happy to chat to you afterwards. So thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you found it useful.